Have you ever felt stuck trying to speak English, worried about perfect grammar or the right words? You're not alone. The secret to speaking English fluently and naturally isn't about being perfect. It's about listening, practicing, and letting go of the fear of making mistakes. In this story, we'll follow Andrew's journey from struggling with English to speaking with confidence, showing you how anyone can speak English naturally, just like a native speaker. Andrew always wanted to speak English like it was part of him, like it was something that came from inside, not something he had to force. But every time someone looked at him and said something in English, his whole body froze. His mind went blank. He could hear the words, but his brain started thinking about grammar rules. Is this the right tense? Did I say that correctly? Should I use have or had? These thoughts filled his head like traffic. On a busy street, in the classroom or office, when a group was having a discussion in English, Andrew would stay quiet. He didn't want to make a mistake. He didn't want to sound wrong. People would laugh and talk and use small jokes, but Andrew would just smile and stay silent. Sometimes he tried to say something, but the words came out too slow or too formal. He felt like a robot. His voice didn't match the energy of the group. And when he finally said something, the topic had already changed. This happened again and again. One time a girl in his office asked him a simple question. "Hey Andrew, did you see that new movie?" Andrew wanted to say, "Yes, I saw it last night, it was amazing." But in his mind, the thoughts were stuck. Should I say I saw or I have seen? What is correct? By the time he was ready to speak, she was already talking to someone else. That night, Andrew sat alone in his room. He played back all the moments in his mind, all the silences, all the late answers, all the times he smiled just to hide his fear. He wasn't scared of people. He was scared of speaking wrong. He was scared of being judged. But one evening, something changed. Andrew was sitting quietly in a coffee shop just watching people. There was a group of young people talking. They were laughing, joking, and sharing stories. And they were speaking in English. But something surprised Andrew. They were not using perfect English. They made small grammar mistakes. They used casual words. Some even mixed their words with small slang. But no one stopped. No one corrected anyone. They just kept going. Their English flowed like a song, not like a rule book. Andrew listened carefully. One of them said, "I was like, oh no, not again." Another said, "She don't even know what happened." Andrew knew these were not perfect grammar sentences, but the way they spoke, it sounded real, natural, alive. It was not about being correct. It was about being comfortable. It was about showing feeling. That moment hit Andrew deep. He realized he had spent too much time trying to be perfect. He was trying to speak English like a textbook. But real English, the one people speak every day, was different. It was not about showing how much grammar you knew. It was about rhythm. It was about connection. It was about letting the words move from your heart to your mouth, even if they weren't perfect. He walked back home with a strange kind of excitement. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about grammar rules. He was thinking about voices, about tone, about expressions. He remembered the way that girl had laughed while saying, "He don't even know." It wasn't correct grammar, but it felt correct. It made sense. It connected. Andrew looked at himself in the mirror that night. He spoke out loud, "I want to speak like that. Not perfect, but natural." His voice shook a little. It was new, but it felt good. From that day, he started listening more, not just reading grammar books, but listening to how people really spoke. He watched videos, movies, podcasts, not to learn rules, but to feel the language. He paused and repeated sentences. He copied the tone, the rhythm, the energy, and slowly, something started to change. The awkward silence inside him started to break. He began to feel the music in the words. He started speaking out loud when he was alone, like talking to a friend. At first, he still felt a little shy, but the more he practiced, the more natural it became. This was not the end of his journey. It was just the beginning. Andrew had finally understood that English was not a test. It was a way to connect, a way to feel, a way to live. And so, with this small shift in his heart and mind, he was ready to move forward, to speak more, to feel more, to grow. Now Andrew had one question. How can I learn to sound natural, just like the people I watched? For as long as Andrew could remember, he had always been obsessed with perfection. Not just in his work or studies, but especially in his English. Growing up, he had been taught that speaking English well meant following strict grammar rules. He knew about every rule: the perfect tense, the past participle, and all the complicated structures. Every time he spoke, he would pause and double-check whether he was following the rules correctly. It made him anxious, and often led to him not speaking at all. He had memorized so many grammar rules that sometimes, when he tried to speak, he couldn't recall the right word or sentence structure. His speech felt robotic and forced, like he was ticking boxes rather than having a conversation. He was so focused on grammar that he forgot what it felt like to speak naturally. Andrew's obsession with getting everything right was holding him back. He knew the rules. He could write essays with flawless grammar, construct the most sophisticated sentences in his mind, but when it came time to speak, he couldn't do it naturally. Every time he had to speak in English, he felt like he was performing a task. He was not having a conversation. He was more focused on grammar, pronunciation, and perfecting every detail. But one day, Andrew had a conversation that changed his entire perspective on speaking English. It happened during a conversation with a group of native English speakers. They were talking about something simple, a recent movie they watched. Andrew sat with them, trying his best to follow along. He knew they were speaking in English, but something about their speech didn't feel like the English he was used to hearing in textbooks or in class. Their sentences were not perfect. They didn't follow every grammar rule. One of them used gonna instead of going to. Another said wanna instead of want to. A third said kinda instead of kind of. At first, Andrew didn't understand what was happening. This didn't match the English textbooks he studied, where perfect grammar was the focus. He expected flawless sentences, but what he heard was something entirely different. It felt more casual, relaxed. There was no tension. The words flowed naturally. It was as if they weren't worrying about the rules at all. They didn't just use contractions like I'm or don't, which he knew about. They said things like gonna, wanna, and kinda with such ease that it sounded natural. The conversation didn't sound forced or rehearsed. It wasn't about having perfect grammar. It was about communicating easily, having a conversation, and being understood. But what was even more shocking to Andrew was the fact that despite their imperfect grammar, they spoke with such confidence. People around them understood exactly what they were saying. And the most important thing? They were connecting. People were laughing, smiling, engaging, and responding to them. Andrew sat there taking it all in. He started to realize that the focus of communication wasn't on perfection. What mattered was the message, the connection, and how comfortable people felt when speaking. This was a game-changing revelation for him. His obsession with perfect grammar was stopping him from speaking naturally. All along, he had been focused on something that wasn't as important as he had thought. So Andrew made a promise to himself. From that day on, he would stop chasing perfection. He would speak without worrying about making mistakes. He would focus on being natural in his speech. Instead of aiming for perfect grammar, he would aim for comfort, clarity, and connection. He knew that English wasn't about impressing others with perfect sentences. It was about speaking in a way that people could easily understand and engage with. If he stumbled on a word, it didn't matter as long as he was clear. If he mixed up a tense, it wasn't the end of the world. What mattered most was feeling comfortable in the language and not being afraid to make mistakes. Because every mistake was an opportunity to learn. In the past, Andrew would often overthink his words before speaking. He would pause in the middle of a sentence, trying to remember the right word or tense. This only made him more anxious and nervous. But now, after watching the native speakers, he began to realize that he didn't need to know everything. He didn't need to sound perfect. He just needed to speak. He understood now that to speak English well, he needed to stop overthinking and start living in the language. To feel the language. That meant learning to speak the way real people spoke, not the way textbooks taught him to speak. Real people didn't worry about grammar every second. They focused on expressing themselves and connecting with others. At first, this was difficult for Andrew. He had spent so much time in his studies focusing on rules that it felt strange to let go of them. But he tried. He started small. He would speak out loud, even if he wasn't sure if everything was grammatically correct. He practiced with friends and colleagues, focusing on being understood, not perfect. Andrew soon realized that when he stopped worrying about perfection, his confidence grew. He was no longer stuck in his head thinking about grammar. Instead, he was focused on the conversation. He began speaking more naturally, and people started to understand him better. He was making fewer mistakes, but more. Importantly, he wasn't afraid to make them. He was growing comfortable in the language. As time went on, Andrew became less critical of himself. The more he practiced, the more natural his speaking became. His vocabulary grew. His confidence grew. And before long, he found himself in conversations where he didn't even think twice about grammar. He wasn't perfect, but he was comfortable. And that was enough. But it wasn't just about speaking more confidently. It was about learning. The more Andrew spoke, the more he learned. Each time he made a mistake, he would correct himself and try again. And each time, he sounded a little better. What really helped him was that he started enjoying his conversations more. Speaking wasn't something he had to do. It was something he wanted to do. He wanted to share ideas, tell stories, ask questions, and learn from others. And with each conversation, he got better at it. And that's when Andrew learned the most important lesson of all. Natural English is about practice, not perfection. The more you speak, the better you get. The more you let go of your need to be perfect, the more you can be real, relaxed, and confident. By embracing imperfection, Andrew had set himself free. His journey towards speaking naturally was no longer a battle against himself. It was a journey of growth, learning, and connection. Andrew had always heard English, but there's a big difference between hearing something and listening to it. Hearing was passive. He would hear sounds, words, and phrases, but they didn't always stick. They didn't really mean anything to him. Listening, on the other hand, was active. It wasn't just about hearing words. It was about understanding the flow of language, how words were used, the emotions behind them, and the connections that they made. At first, Andrew had no idea how much he was missing. He would watch English movies, television shows, and even YouTube videos, but most of the time, he was more focused on the meaning of the words than the sound of them. He was still trapped in the traditional way of learning. He tried to memorize phrases, looking up translations for every single word, all while trying to connect them into grammatically correct sentences. But over time, he started to realize something critical. Natural English isn't about knowing the exact meaning of every word. It's about understanding how language flows, how people speak it in everyday life. One day, while watching a casual podcast, Andrew suddenly noticed something. The hosts weren't using perfect grammar. They weren't speaking in long, formal sentences, and they weren't following the rules of textbook English. Instead, they were using short phrases, informal words, and even slang. They sounded comfortable with the language, like it was part of them. There were pauses between sentences, laughter, and sometimes even the interruption of one speaker by another. There was a rhythm to their speech, a rhythm Andrew had never noticed before. It was natural. Andrew began to realize that English speakers didn't always focus on grammar rules. They just spoke. They lived the language. They understood it through use, not through textbooks. And that was the secret to natural fluency. What struck Andrew the most during this time was the intonation and pauses in English. Native speakers didn't always speak in a straight line. They used pauses for effect. A simple pause in speech could change the meaning of a sentence, or it could help the listener better understand the message. Andrew noticed how people's voices would go up when asking a question, or how they would slow down when sharing something important. For example, when someone said, "You know what I mean?" the voice would rise at the end, signaling that they were looking for confirmation. Or when someone shared something they were passionate about, their voice might drop and become softer as they spoke more slowly, emphasizing the importance of what they were saying. Andrew also began to understand the importance of natural rhythm in conversation. It wasn't just about getting the words right. It was about getting the flow of the conversation right. Every conversation had its own rhythm. Some people spoke quickly with bursts of excitement and energy, while others took their time, choosing each word carefully, creating a comfortable space between sentences. By paying close attention to this natural rhythm, Andrew learned how to avoid sounding robotic or unnatural in his own speech. He no longer tried to speak like a textbook. Instead, he started speaking with the natural flow that he had been hearing all along. Andrew also began to embrace the real English, the English used in everyday situations. This wasn't the English that came from books or formal lessons. It was the English of the streets, the slang, and the informal expressions. He learned that expressions like gonna, wanna, and gimme were perfectly acceptable in everyday conversations. No one used will or going to all the time in real life. These contractions made speech sound smoother, faster, and most importantly, more natural. For example, when people said, "I'm gonna grab a coffee," it wasn't incorrect English. It was simply a natural way of speaking that mirrored the rhythm of normal, everyday life. The more Andrew listened, the more he realized that he didn't need to be afraid of these words. He didn't need to avoid them. They were part of real life, and they helped people connect. One evening, after watching several conversations and interviews, Andrew decided to try it himself. He was tired of speaking like a robot, trying to get every sentence right. He wanted to speak naturally. He decided to mimic the sentences he had heard during his listening exercises. For example, the phrase, "I'm gonna grab a coffee," felt strange at first, but as he repeated it aloud, it felt more comfortable. It didn't sound as forced as when he said, "I will go to grab a coffee." Slowly, he began saying these phrases more often in his daily life. When he did, he felt a wave of relief. This was how people really spoke. He wasn't faking it anymore. He was just being real. And that was when he felt a major shift. His confidence started growing, and his speech began to feel more genuine. English didn't feel like a subject anymore. It felt like a tool he could use to express himself. Like, "and, you know." Another pattern Andrew noticed was how often people used the words "like" and "you know" in their speech. These words didn't carry any heavy meaning, but they were a normal part of conversation. For instance, when someone said, "It's like really funny," they weren't trying to convey the exact meaning of "like." They were just using it as a way to pause and gather their thoughts. Or when someone said, "I was just, tired," the phrase "you know" wasn't necessarily asking if the other person knew they were tired. It was simply a way to add familiarity to the conversation, to make the listener feel included. At first, Andrew wasn't sure if using these words was acceptable. But the more he listened, the more he realized that these little phrases were part of natural speech. They helped make conversations feel more comfortable and relaxed. At first he was hesitant to use them, But as he began to speak with more people, he saw how natural it was to use like or you know. It wasn't about being correct. It was about sounding real. Eventually, Andrew started using them himself. When he did, he noticed his conversations were smoother. People responded more easily, and his fear of speaking in English started to fade away. By now, Andrew had been listening for weeks. He had immersed himself in English and was soaking up as much as he could. But listening wasn't enough anymore. He felt ready. It was time to speak. He had learned so much by hearing others speak naturally, and he knew it was time to put it into practice. His next step would be to start speaking in a similar way. To drop the textbook English, avoid overthinking, and just speak naturally. But how could he practice this new form of speaking? That's when Andrew realized that speaking naturally wasn't just about imitating others. It was about getting comfortable with himself in English. It was about practicing the rhythm, the pauses, the flow, and the vocabulary that felt most natural to him. As Andrew started speaking more, he realized that the rhythm of natural speech was not something that could be forced. It had to come from practice and a genuine connection with the language. The more he practiced, the more fluent he became. He wasn't just translating in his head anymore. His thoughts and words began to come out in English naturally. Andrew was ready to face the next challenge, speaking out loud every day. He now felt more prepared to speak confidently, and this confidence would lead him to discover how powerful speaking was when combined with deep listening. This was only the beginning, and Andrew's journey was far from over. The journey to speaking English naturally wasn't about perfect grammar or flawless vocabulary. It was about connection, confidence, and practice. Andrew's journey to speaking English naturally began with a shift in mindset. He had been trying hard to memorize phrases, vocabularies, and dialogues for years. But as much as he tried, something always felt missing. Even though he had accumulated a vast amount of knowledge, he struggled to speak fluently when faced with real conversations. The sentences he had memorized seemed stiff. The words felt forced, and he couldn't help but notice how his speech sounded unnatural. It wasn't like how native speakers spoke. Their words flowed easily. Their tone adjusted with the mood of the conversation, and their sentences felt fluid and unplanned. How did they do that? Andrew soon realized that the key to mastering English wasn't to memorize more words or rules, but to imitate how people naturally spoke. He had spent so much time trying to master the textbook version of English that he had forgotten one crucial thing. Language is a living, breathing thing. It evolves. It changes. It is alive in the way people speak with emotion, tone, and body language. So Andrew decided to step away from his rigid, bookish way of learning and embrace a more dynamic, organic approach to speaking. At first, Andrew was hesitant. He had been conditioned to believe that if he didn't memorize the right words, he would fail. But as he watched native speakers in movies, podcasts, and TV shows, he realized that they didn't memorize anything. Instead, they learned by mimicking. The phrases they used felt spontaneous, natural, and filled with emotion. He could see that the real secret to speaking fluently was to copy how they spoke, rather than memorize lists of vocabulary words. So, he stopped trying to memorize entire conversations. Instead, he began to imitate voices, focusing not just on the words, but on the sound and emotion behind them. When he heard a phrase that caught his attention, he would pause the video, repeat it aloud, and try to mirror the tone, speed, and feeling in the speaker's voice. He wasn't worried about exact words or perfect pronunciation. He just wanted to capture the rhythm and feel the flow of the sentence. At first, Andrew felt awkward. He would stand in front of the mirror, repeating sentences over and over, not sure if it would make a difference. But something amazing started to happen. Every time he imitated a sentence, his voice began to feel more natural. It didn't sound like a robot reading words. It sounded real, like he was actually part of the conversation. His pace became smoother. He could feel the emotions of the speaker in his own voice. Instead of worrying about whether his grammar was correct, he focused on getting the rhythm right. As Andrew practiced, he began to understand that speaking naturally wasn't just about the words, it was about the emotion behind them. When he watched his favorite TV characters, he noticed that the characters didn't speak with perfect grammar all the time. Sometimes they spoke in incomplete sentences or used slang. But their words were full of emotion, and that's what made them sound real. For instance, if a character was angry, their voice was sharp, fast, and full of frustration. When someone was excited, their speech was quicker, filled with energy and enthusiasm. Andrew realized that this was what made English sound so natural. It wasn't just the words, it was how the speaker felt when saying them. And if he wanted to speak English like them, he needed to feel the words too. One evening, while practicing a line from a movie, Andrew decided to add his own twist. He mimicked a scene where a character was excited and said, "I can't believe this is happening." But instead of just saying it the way the actor did, Andrew put his own excitement into it. He felt the words, and his voice reflected it. The words didn't just come out of his mouth, they came from his heart. As Andrew continued to practice, he began to pay attention to the subtle nuances in how native speakers constructed their sentences. It wasn't just about the words, it was about how the sentences were built. Sometimes they didn't follow strict grammar rules. Instead, they focused on how words connected, how they sounded when said together. For example, he noticed that native speakers often dropped words in informal speech. For instance, instead of saying, "I am going to the store," they might say, "I'm going to the store." Or instead of, "What are you doing?" they might say, "What are you doing?" They didn't care about perfect grammar. They cared about speaking in a way that was easy and comfortable. Andrew also started to notice how words were stressed in different situations. Some words were emphasized more than others. For example, in the sentence, "I can't believe this is happening," the word believe was stressed more than the others. Andrew began experimenting with this in his own speech. He would pause, stress the right words, and let the sentence flow naturally. One of the biggest changes Andrew experienced was when he stopped focusing on grammar rules and started focusing on the rhythm of speech. He knew that native speakers spoke in a specific rhythm, a natural flow of words, like music. Some sentences were faster, while others slowed down to add emphasis or importance. When Andrew started imitating real conversations, he paid close attention to how the rhythm of speech worked. He learned when to speed up and when to slow down. He noticed how some sentences had more energy while others had a calming effect. He learned how pauses worked, how a dramatic pause in a conversation could change the entire meaning of a sentence. Sometimes a sentence wasn't just about the words. It was about how you delivered them. At the beginning of his journey, Andrew wasn't confident at all. His English didn't sound right. It felt forced. But through imitation, he slowly started to sound more like a real speaker. Every time he practiced mimicking someone else's speech, he felt a little less nervous. His confidence grew. He felt that his English was improving because he was no longer focusing on rules or memorization. He was simply speaking from the heart. He could now have conversations without worrying about how his speech sounded. The more he imitated, the more fluid his speech became. He felt connected to the words, not just saying them for the sake of speaking. The way he spoke was no longer rigid or formal. It had become effortless. Every day he got better at expressing himself clearly and naturally. As Andrew practiced more and more, he started to realize that speaking English naturally didn't require perfection. It required comfort, practice, and a lot of patience. Through imitating, he learned that real English wasn't something you could memorize. It was something you could feel, experience, and live. His words became like a rhythm, and the more he spoke, the more fluent he became. Andrew knew that the only way to truly become fluent and confident in speaking English was to practice every single day. At first it felt strange, awkward even, But he understood that language wasn't just about memorizing vocabulary or following complex rules. It was about living the language, making it a part of everyday life. For most of his life, he had been taught English as something to learn in a classroom, as something to be tested on, but he realized that wasn't the right way to approach it. Speaking English naturally would require more than studying from books. It would take real-world practice, patience, and consistency. So, he decided to speak English every day, even if no one else was around. Andrew didn't wait for the perfect moment to have a conversation. He didn't wait for a teacher or a friend to prompt him. He realized that the key to fluency was simply starting, even if no one was listening. And that's when he began his journey to speak every single day. At first, Andrew practiced the simple things, small sentences, little phrases, and basic expressions that were part of his everyday routine. He would speak to himself while he was in the kitchen preparing breakfast. Instead of staying quiet or thinking in his native language, he began narrating his actions. When he was making tea, he would say out loud, "I'm making tea." It wasn't anything complex, but it felt good. It was a small start, but it was real. It was English in action. The more he spoke aloud to himself, the more comfortable it felt. He started talking to himself in English while doing everything, whether it was washing dishes, choosing a shirt to wear, or getting ready for work. "This smells good," he would say when he added spices to the tea or when he cooked dinner. It was simple, but each time he spoke in English, he could feel the language becoming a part of him. His thoughts were no longer separate from the words he spoke. The more he practiced, the more the language felt natural. When he walked through the park in the morning, he didn't just walk in silence. He started thinking in English, forming sentences like, "I think the weather is nice today," or "I'm walking by the river." At first it was like speaking to himself, but as time went on, he realized something amazing. The more he spoke, the more he stopped translating from his native language. He wasn't constantly thinking about how to translate thoughts from his own language into English. He didn't need to work out the grammar or sentence structure in his head. The words just flowed. They didn't feel forced or unnatural anymore. Andrew had learned that fluency was all about thinking in the language, not just understanding the words, but internalizing them so that they became a natural part of his daily life. It wasn't enough to memorize lists of words or read textbooks. Fluency meant that when he thought about his day, the thoughts came in English. The moment he stopped translating was the moment he began speaking with confidence and ease. At first, Andrew had been so afraid of making mistakes. He feared that people would judge him or laugh at him for speaking imperfectly. But now, he saw that practicing every day, even if he was speaking to himself, was giving him the confidence to use the language. He didn't worry about making mistakes anymore. Instead of being afraid of speaking, he began to look forward to it. Each time he spoke, he got better. And each time he spoke, he felt better. The key was that he didn't try to speak perfectly. Perfection wasn't his goal anymore. Instead, he focused on making small improvements every day. Even the smallest conversation, whether in the kitchen or while walking, made a difference. Slowly, he could feel himself becoming more fluent, more natural in his speech. Andrew also realized that consistency was key. It wasn't about speaking perfectly for an hour one day and then not speaking at all for a week. It was about making it a habit, incorporating English into his life in small ways every day. And so, he kept talking. He talked about the weather, about his plans for the day, about things that didn't matter much, but still gave him a chance to use his English in real situations. The more he spoke, the more natural it felt. He wasn't pretending to speak English. He was living it. Speaking every day also made him more comfortable with pronunciation. In the beginning, he had struggled with certain sounds and words, but as he practiced, he could feel his mouth getting used to the rhythm of English. He learned how to make the sounds, how to stress the right words, and how to say things in a way that sounded more native-like. His accent became less of a barrier, and more of a natural feature of his speech. The most surprising thing, however, was that as he practiced speaking aloud, he realized how much fun it could be. At first he thought it would feel forced, like a chore. But soon he started to enjoy it. Speaking English became a way to connect with the world, a way to express himself. Even though he was talking to himself, it felt like he was having a conversation with the world. One day, while getting ready for a friend's party, he looked at himself in the mirror. He said aloud, "I think this shirt looks great today," and then he laughed. It wasn't a perfect sentence, and he didn't care. He just knew that he was speaking with confidence, and that was all that mattered. It was a simple habit, but speaking every day, even for just a few minutes, made all the difference. The more he did it, the more natural English felt. He started to realize that English wasn't something to be feared. It was something to be embraced. It was about being comfortable with the language, even if it meant making mistakes along the way. Over time, those mistakes became fewer and fewer, and his speaking skills improved exponentially. Eventually, he started using more complex sentences. He found himself speaking more fluently in casual conversations. He didn't hesitate as much, and when he had to talk to a stranger or in a group, he was no longer intimidated. He had built his confidence with those simple, daily practices. He was no longer the person who hesitated and stumbled over words. He was now able to speak confidently, naturally. And then, one day, as he sat down with his friends at a cafe, he realized just how far he had come. He wasn't thinking about the words anymore. He wasn't worried about grammar. He wasn't counting his sentences in his head. He was just speaking, fluently, naturally, confidently. He couldn't believe how much he had grown, how much progress he had made just by speaking English every day. Andrew didn't need to practice for hours at a time anymore. He had changed his approach. By making it a part of his daily life, English had become second nature to him. As Andrew sat back and enjoyed the conversation, he smiled to himself. This was the magic of language. When it becomes natural, when it becomes you. Andrew had been practicing his English diligently for months. He had been through the motions of listening, imitating, and speaking by himself. Yet, there was still a part of him that felt something was missing. He realized that the most crucial piece of the puzzle was real-life conversation. English wasn't just about memorizing words and sentences. It was about connecting with people, sharing experiences, and learning through interaction. So Andrew decided to take a bold step forward. He sought out online groups where people spoke English regularly. These were casual groups, not formal classrooms, where the primary goal wasn't to teach, but to converse. At first he was hesitant. Would he sound silly? Would they judge his accent or his mistakes? But deep down, he knew that if he was going to break through his fears and improve his skills, he needed to immerse himself in real conversations. This was the next stage in his learning process. He began with online voice chats. These were platforms where people from all over the world would gather and speak on various topics. The beauty of these platforms was that they didn't care about your background or level of English. What mattered was that you could express yourself. He joined these groups with one simple goal in mind: to connect. He wasn't there to impress anyone with fancy vocabulary or perfect grammar. He was there to practice, learn, and improve. During his first few sessions, Andrew made the classic mistakes: mispronunciations, wrong tenses, awkward pauses. But each mistake was a lesson in itself. When he stammered or hesitated instead of feeling embarrassed, he learned to embrace the moment. He understood that every mistake wasn't a setback. It was a step forward. Every time he said the wrong word or mixed up a sentence, someone was there to help him. These small corrections were priceless. They gave him the confidence to keep going. In these groups, he encountered people from all walks of life, each with their own stories, accents, and ways of speaking. Some spoke more formally, while others used slang and expressions that were new to him. What struck him most was that English speakers, even the native ones, didn't always follow the strict rules he had been taught in school. They spoke in a flow, using contractions like gonna for going to, wanna for want to, and kinda for kind of. These were all expressions that textbooks often overlooked, yet they were so common in real-life conversations. For Andrew, this was a revelation. The English he had been taught in school was rigid, textbook English, correct but not natural. The English spoken by people in these groups, on the other hand, was fluid, relaxed, and human. People spoke without thinking too much about grammar, rules. They were focused on communicating ideas, emotions, and stories. Andrew quickly understood that speaking English wasn't about perfection. It was about connection. After a few weeks of participating in these conversations, Andrew noticed something significant. His fear started to fade. In the past, he would have been terrified to speak for fear of making a mistake. But now, he found himself more relaxed, laughing with others, sharing his thoughts, and even correcting himself when he slipped up. There was no pressure, only support. The more he spoke, the more he grew. One afternoon, in a particularly engaging conversation about a recent movie he'd seen, Andrew found himself speaking for almost half an hour without stopping. He wasn't thinking about grammar or word choice. He was just speaking. He was telling the story as he experienced it. His sentences weren't perfect, but they were clear. And most importantly, people understood him. They responded with enthusiasm, asking questions, and adding to the conversation. For the first time, he realized that speaking English wasn't about getting every word right. It was about being understood. Andrew also started asking more questions in these groups. This was a tactic he had learned from observing how others interacted. When you don't know something, ask. There was no shame in not knowing the answer. Instead, asking questions showed curiosity, and people appreciated that. They enjoyed helping him learn, and in turn, he was building relationships. His English wasn't just improving because of the lessons he was studying. It was improving because of the connections he was making with real people, real conversations, and real-life experiences. There was another surprising benefit to these conversations. The more Andrew spoke, the more he started to pick up on idiomatic expressions and slang. In one chat, someone casually said, "That's the last straw." Andrew paused and asked, "What does that mean?" A kind person explained that it referred to the moment when you've reached your limit. It was an expression he'd never encountered in textbooks, but it was so common in everyday speech. It was these types of phrases that helped Andrew understand how English was used in the real world, not just in textbooks. As time passed, Andrew's vocabulary grew. But more than that, he became comfortable. He didn't focus on perfection. Instead, he focused on meaning. He began to understand that real conversations weren't about speaking perfectly. They were about sharing ideas and building relationships. He wasn't afraid to speak anymore, even if he made mistakes. Those mistakes no longer made him feel inferior. They were just part of the learning process. The more mistakes he made, the more he grew. Andrew's confidence grew to the point where he started initiating conversations. At first, he would wait for others to speak to him. Now he felt comfortable enough to start conversations on his own. He would ask people about their day, their interests, their opinions on a movie or a book. These weren't forced conversations. They were real, engaging talks that helped him practice his English in ways that felt natural and fun. The turning point came when Andrew joined a voice chat group with native English speakers. At first, he was nervous. He worried they would judge him or find his accent funny. But when he spoke, they didn't mock him. Instead, they listened. They asked him questions, encouraged him, and included him in the conversation. For the first time, he felt like he truly belonged in the English-speaking world. They didn't care about his accent or his mistakes. They cared about the conversation. And that's when Andrew knew he had arrived. This was when he realized that fluent English isn't just about grammar and vocabulary. It's about using the language in a way that feels natural and comfortable. It's about speaking like a native speaker, not because you've memorized their words, but because you've learned to understand them in a way that allows you to express yourself authentically. By the end of the year, Andrew's speaking abilities had improved drastically. He was no longer worried about making mistakes. Instead, he was focused on the message he wanted to share. He was no longer intimidated by English speakers. Instead, he was excited to connect with them. And now, as Andrew looks back on his journey, he understands that real growth in language comes from real conversations. English isn't just something you learn in isolation. It's something you live, breathe, and practice in the world around you. Every conversation is a chance to grow, and every mistake is a step toward fluency. As Andrew's journey with English progressed, he realized something profound. Language is more than words. It's about connection, understanding, and growth. And through real conversations, that's exactly what he achieved. Andrew sat in the park one evening, staring at the people passing by. Some were chatting in English, laughing and sharing stories. Others were speaking in different languages, but no matter what language they were speaking, there was one thing that stood out. Everyone was speaking naturally, and that's when it hit him. He didn't think about his words before they came out anymore. He didn't stop to ask himself if he was saying things correctly or whether his grammar was perfect. He wasn't constantly worried about whether people would understand him or judge him. Instead, he just spoke. He just communicated. It wasn't always this way. In fact, it had taken a long time to get here. In the beginning, Andrew was like most people learning a new language. He had the urge to memorize everything, to get every rule correct. He would constantly correct himself in mid-sentence, making sure his grammar was perfect, only to realize that by doing so, he was holding himself back. He wasn't enjoying the conversation. He wasn't connecting with others. And that's what he wanted. He wanted to connect with people. He wanted to be able to share his thoughts, his feelings, his stories with the world, without worrying if every little word was correct. Because, over time, Andrew realized that language isn't just about grammar and vocabulary. Language is about connection. It's about sharing who you are, where you come from, and what you believe. Andrew's breakthrough moment came one day when he was talking to a friend. They were having a simple conversation about the weather. It was nothing important, just a casual chat. But Andrew noticed something. He wasn't thinking about grammar. He wasn't searching for the right words. He was just speaking. And his friend was listening, responding, laughing. They were having a real conversation. In that moment, he realized that speaking English wasn't about memorizing perfect grammar rules or remembering an endless list of vocabulary words. It wasn't about how well you could speak, but how well you could connect. So Andrew stopped trying to be perfect. He stopped worrying about saying things correctly. Instead, he focused on saying things the way he naturally felt them. He learned to trust his intuition when speaking. If he didn't know a word, he found another way to explain what he meant. He started using phrases he had heard in conversations, even if they weren't proper English. Words like gonna, wanna, kinda, and you know became part of his everyday speech. At first, he was nervous. He was afraid that people would judge him for not using perfect grammar. But he soon learned that people don't care about perfect grammar. They care about what you're saying. They care about the connection you're making with them. They care about whether they can understand you and relate to you. Andrew began practicing speaking more and more. He didn't just speak when he had to. He spoke every chance he got. He spoke to his family, his friends, and even strangers. He spoke when he was at the grocery store, in line at the coffee shop, and while walking down the street. He would practice describing things, telling short stories, and even making small talk with anyone who would listen. The more he spoke, the more comfortable he became. At first, his sentences were short and simple, but as time went on, they became longer, more complex. But no matter how long his sentences got, they still had that natural flow. He didn't worry about making mistakes anymore. He just let his words come out, and that's when he noticed something incredible. The more he spoke, the easier it became. One of the biggest changes in Andrew's speaking came from his attitude. He stopped seeing speaking English as a task to complete or as something to be perfected. Instead, he saw it as a tool for expressing himself. He didn't see English as something he had to get right every time. He saw it as a way to communicate, to share his thoughts, his ideas, and his experiences with the world around him. But there was still a lot of fear. Fear that he wasn't good enough. Fear that people would judge him. Fear of speaking incorrectly. But over time, he realized that this fear was only holding him back. Every time he spoke, he faced his fear. And each time he faced that fear, he grew stronger. He grew more confident. He learned to trust himself and his ability to communicate, even when things weren't perfect. And then, one day, it happened. Andrew was having a conversation with a colleague at work when his colleague stopped and said, "Andrew, your English is really good. You speak like a native speaker now. I can't believe how much you've improved." Andrew smiled, but inside, he felt a sense of pride. He had worked hard to get here. He had practiced, he had failed, and he had learned. But most importantly, he had kept going. He had learned to speak English naturally, just like he spoke his first language. It wasn't about memorizing rules. It was about trusting himself. It was about listening to the language, speaking from his heart, and expressing himself clearly. Over the years, Andrew became a confident speaker. His conversations flowed effortlessly, just like they did when he spoke with his friends and family. He didn't stop and think about every word. He didn't stop and worry about grammar. He just spoke, and the words came naturally. Looking back on his journey, Andrew understood that speaking naturally wasn't about being flawless. It was about feeling comfortable in your own skin, accepting the mistakes, and learning from them. It was about being real, not trying to sound perfect. Because when you try to be perfect, you miss the beauty of authentic communication. Andrew's journey also taught him that everyone has their own pace. Some people might take longer to get comfortable with a language, and that's okay. What matters is consistency. It's about practicing every day, making the effort to listen, speak, and grow. And Andrew's story is a reminder that, no matter how challenging it might seem at first, anyone can speak English naturally. You just need to be patient with yourself. His message to everyone is simple. Don't try to speak perfectly. Just speak. Let it flow naturally. Trust yourself, and the rest will come. Andrew's transformation from a worried, hesitant speaker to a confident, natural English speaker wasn't something that happened overnight. It took time, dedication, and the willingness to fail. But in the end, it was all worth it. And if you found inspiration in Andrew's story, or if you're on your own journey to speak English naturally, don't give up. Keep practicing, keep listening, and keep speaking. You've got this, and if you found value in this story, like, share, and comment below. Let's keep growing together. And don't forget to subscribe to English Tone, where we help you speak naturally and confidently every day.